Good day all. My name is Dr. Ogedise from University of Botswana. I conducted a study with Dr. Habulezi from Baisako University, and the topic of our study is teachers' voices on transition planning practices for students with visual impairments in senior secondary schools in Botswana. And so, as we may be aware, Sustainable Development Goal number 4 calls for all nations to provide an inclusive, equitable, and quality education for all learners, all citizens, whether one has a disability or not. And teachers' role cannot be ignored in this regard, as they play a critical part in the realization of this goal. And evidence suggests that transition of students with visual impairments from high school to post-secondary settings is oftentimes problematic, challenging, and difficult. And so there is need for teachers to be knowledgeable, to have adequate skills to plan and implement transition programs for these learners effectively. And so you will realize that in Botswana, there's a positive research on transition planning practices and on teachers' perceptions regarding these practices. And so we conducted a study in order to look at teachers' perceptions of transition planning practices for students with visual impairments in Botswana. And so our focus was on 3 kinds of teachers: special education teachers, general education teachers, and guidance and counseling teachers. And so there were 2 research questions. The first one related to exploring or understanding senior secondary teachers' perceptions with respect to transition planning practices, and if these practices helped students with visual impairments to transition successfully to post-school outcomes or settings. And the second question related to looking at the differences between the 3 groups of teachers in terms of their transition planning practices, perceptions. And so in terms of the method, we conducted a quantitative research and used a cross-sectional survey research method, in which we had a paper and pen survey consisting of closed-ended questions, and the research setting was one senior secondary school in Gauteng region, and that is the only senior secondary school in the country that enrolls and provides appropriate supports for learners with visual impairments. And teachers aged from 20 years to above 60 participated in the study. And again, we used purposive sampling to select participants for this study. And 114 out of 136 teachers participated, yielding a return rate of about 84%. And we also followed ethical guidelines as required, and written consent was secured from teachers prior to completing the survey. And again, in terms of the analysis of the data, we used non-parametric tests, Kruskal-Wallis of K groups, to determine differences between the 3 groups of teachers. And where differences existed, where there was a significant difference, we further used Mann-Whitney-U as a follow-up to determine where differences or the kinds of groups that differed. And so now, in terms of the results, teachers perceived that a number of things were happening in terms of the transition planning practices, that students were trained in self-determination skills, in assistive technology, in orientation and mobility skills, in academic skills, that teachers were provided with vocational instruction, and that they were also provided with paid work opportunities outside the school environment. So now, in terms of the differences on teachers' perceptions of transition planning practices, a number of things or differences were observed. The first one being that general education teachers agreed more than special education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers that students were trained in self-determination and that they were trained in social skills and orientation and mobility. And you also saw that special education teachers, general education teachers and special education teachers agreed more than guidance and counseling teachers that students were provided or were trained in assistive technology. But there were disagreements, one concerning that students were provided with paid or unpaid work opportunities within the school, wherein general education teachers disagreed more than special education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers. And we also saw that general education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers disagreed more than special education teachers that students were provided with unpaid work opportunities outside the school setting. And we also saw that general education teachers agreed more than special education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers that students were provided with paid work opportunities outside the school. And we also noted that guidance and general education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers, general education teachers and special education teachers agreed more than guidance and counseling teachers that students were provided with vocational instruction and that they were also trained in academic skills, wherein special education teachers agreed more than guidance and counseling teachers on this item. And so what this tells us is that generally teachers agreed that students with visual impairments were prepared for successful post-school outcomes at senior secondary schools. And these perceived perceptions or practices are consistent with literature, and we know they are key in enhancing successful post-school outcomes. And of course, we saw that teachers had mixed views in terms of that perceptions of transition planning practices. And there were few notable differences between special education teachers and guidance and counseling teachers, especially with relation to self-determination and training in academic skills, wherein special education teachers had a higher level of agreement than guidance and counseling teachers. And in terms of provision of work experiences that is outside the school in relation to those where students were not paid or unpaid, we noticed that guidance and counseling teachers had a higher level of agreement than special education teachers. But of course, we know the importance of special education teachers in transition planning, which means they need to have adequate knowledge of the transition planning process, and that if they have positive views about transition planning, then that puts them at a meaningful place where they can actually deliver um, appropriately to enhance successful transition of students with visual impairments. But you see, these disparities in teachers' perceptions based on whether one is a special education teacher or a guidance and counseling teacher or a general education teacher can also be attributed to what researchers in the past have found in Botswana, that there is poor collaboration and coordination among teachers. And so the question is, what are the conclusions and implications um, based on the findings? Um, the first thing that we need to know that is overall or generally, um, something is taking place in terms of transition planning for students with visual impairments in Botswana senior secondary schools. But if you look at the disparities, one can they say it is important for professional development activities to take place with respect to transition planning so that teachers are on the same page with respect to their understanding of the transition planning process. And so in terms of the curriculum, there is need to spiral transition in the curriculum rather than what we currently have, where there's only one course that is offered at the University of Botswana with respect to transition. And there's also need for the Ministry of Education and Skills Development to provide or to increase funding to hire more special education teachers in senior secondary schools, as well as support learners with visual impairments insofar as their education and transition is concerned. And schools also need to collaborate or to develop and establish meaningful partnerships with external entities to support learners' transition needs. And lastly, there is need for the government to make concerted efforts, of course, with other relevant stakeholders to develop or to enact a transition planning policy or transition legal framework, because this will provide more specific guidelines as to what needs to happen in schools if students with disabilities, including those with visual impairments, are to transition successfully to post-school outcomes. So generally, those are the findings and the conclusions of our study. And here we have a few references that one can refer to for more information. And with those few words, thank you very much for your listenership. Thank you.